So the real title of this is Making Codes Fun Again. We don't have great hats, unfortunately. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to Green Build Friday. Anybody go to Buddy Guy last night? Or see him? Wasn't that awesome? Who's into blues again? And then we have a stellar lineup today. These folks you see on screen and on stage. I'll let them do short introductions of themselves. I'm Wes Sullins with USGBC. Here's our learning objectives. When you get the surveys for this later on, please be a little bit kind, because those of us that made it to the after party are struggling to be coherent. And those of us who are coherent didn't go to the party, so have a little sympathy. Be sure to tweet what you find here today. So this session, you've all read it, and if you're here at 8 a.m. on a codes topic, you're going to get the joke about how it must be dedicated, right? But this is all about the rise of green codes and some of the latest things that are happening for USGBC. And so as we've seen adoptions of green building codes, from energy to full green sets, like things you'll find in California and in other states and cities, we've seen this evolution where a lot of the good strategies we've streamlined in LEED are now ready to be adopted at the regulatory level on many more places. And we've seen kind of a smattering. There's a lot of energy codes now. There's starting to be more green codes. But what we're here to do is hope to green all buildings. How do we get every building code to start to adopt these measures? And that's what we're going to talk about today. USGBC is a sponsor of the IGCC. We've been working on this since it was developed a number of years ago. And we're excited because this just got published last week. The document is out, it's for sale, it's ready to go. And it's a collaboration of the logos you see on the screen there. I think it really represents the first time that we've all come together on one good model building code that can be adopted widely. And kind of a noisy slide here, but what we've got here is the 2018 IGC is unique because it's a combination of several documents. It's the ASHRAE Standard 189.1, which has been around since 2009, 2010, and also the IGCC, the International Green Construction Code, which has had a couple of iterations, but importantly for the 2018 version, these are coming together in one document. So it's the technical content of 189, it's the administrative and enforcement procedures of the ICC, and putting those together in a book. And it's run by, the technical aspects are run by the ASHRAE committee through the ASHRAE process. So what we used to have was these sort of co-opetition model of these two documents that had a compliance option for each other. So if you were in a jurisdiction that had the IGCC, you could use 189 as a compliance path, or vice versa. But that's been a bit confusing to the marketplace, we think. And it's also just a lot of extra effort to develop two very similar documents. So these have been folded into one, the IGCC 2018. Now, on the bottom there, you'll see the LEED timeline, and of course, LEED goes back before that, but the idea we want to share today is that we're also coordinating the LEED rating system with this model code to, again, try to harmonize these things. Here's a graphic. It's not going to be real easy to read, I don't think, but what's going on here is along the bottom, we have the traditional building codes, and over time, you'll see that the green building codes, which is this grayish color, hopefully they'll start to merge. Like as the basics of good, green strategies become mainstreamed, those can become part of the core building code. And as that happens, we can also use things like LEED to ratchet up and mark on top of those. And importantly, at the far right here, you even see an opportunity for the LEED rating system to really line up with that model code. And we're interested in working with jurisdictions on finding ways to support green code enforcement, et cetera. And this is important because USGBC doesn't see this as a zero-sum game. We see this as a win-win. Without codes and the regulatory framework kind of pushing the floor up, if you will, the LEED rating system is kind of limited in what we can do to keep ratcheting up higher. Especially in international markets, if we're working in a place that doesn't have the expertise or the skills or the materials or products for green building, it's hard to get a LEED building. And so our goal is to, of course, green all buildings. That's our mission. And we know that the codes and the regulatory framework is a big part of that. So we see this as a harmony and want to push it far and wide. So something we've done this is online on our website. I'll share in a minute. we've developed a list of kind of the top 20 measures in the IGCC, plus prerequisites, that are ready for alignment and lead. I'm just going to share one kind of close-up, because that was too hard to read, of this. And what you got here on the left is your lead category. You've got the credits within lead, a corresponding IGCC measure that is lined up with that, and whether or not, how many points that's worth or a prerequisite. And importantly, on the far right there is the achievement rates in lead. And as you can see, those are all very high achievement rates. So we think those measures are ready for prime time. They're ready to be adopted in a building code. And what we're going to do with this document, with these 20 or so measures in lead, is take those to our lead steering committee and see if we can get them, I think we can, pre-approved as a streamlining path in the jurisdiction that adopts it. So if you're building to code and you want to do lead, you can use the code compliance process to verify these measures, and that cuts down on the duplication to do lead in that jurisdiction. We've done this before. I know the text is a little off on the bottom there. We've done this in California. California has a green building code and an energy code that's quite stringent, and we've now got these alternative compliance paths. So if you're building in that state to the codes and you have a lead project, you can get all your prerequisites and up to 6 points streamlined. We also have a pathway for IDC and homes, and we've also lined up the energy code in California, so you don't have to double up on energy modeling in the state. So we hope that these types of connections will lead to greater interest and more ease of use of green codes. We've got a bunch of things on our website. This is a brand new website. Encourage you to go see it. And there's a screenshot of the new page. So new.usgbc.org/greencodes. And a lot of the stuff you've seen on the screen, that document, the infographic, et cetera, is all downloadable from that page. And we'll be adding to it as we gather resources. So the big goal, and that's why we're here today, is adoptions far and wide. How do we get all buildings green? And that's what I've asked our panelists to come up today and talk about. So how to green all buildings. What we're going to do, we have a challenge this morning. We have 1 hour. We have 5 speakers, and we're trying to be interactive about codes. So we thought, spent a long time deciding, how can we distill this down into just a few points? And we came up with these 3 questions that we're going to ask our panelists. How can we get green codes adopted everywhere? What gaps exist? And do green codes stifle leadership? That's an important question. These all, I think, are integral to finding solutions to adopting code. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each person to answer this question, spend 2 minutes, and if you go over, I'm going to cut them off. Apologize in advance. And then after that, we're going to ask the room to help answer questions for a few minutes as well. So we want this to be interactive. Please shout out after somebody says something, not as they're speaking, after their 2 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion and dialogue as much as possible. Use the microphone. Okay. Yeah. Sound good? Sound good. Okay. So, whose slide is this?
My mic is up. Great.
You are up.
I'm Mara Baum with HOK. I lead our global health and wellness practice. And so I'll be talking a little bit about codes through that lens of health and well-being. And in terms of adoption of green codes everywhere, I work all over the country. I am based in the Bay Area, so it looks not so different from that where we are right now, unfortunately. But I do work across a very broad range of states. And a community organizer friend many years ago taught me an incredibly valuable lesson, which was that I need to meet people where they are and not where I want them to be. And so that means that even though I may think that all my clients, and I may want all of my clients to be like LEED Platinum, green codes, etc., I need to understand exactly what would motivate them and not what motivates me. And so when I am in other parts of the country, for example, I won't name names or name places, I don't use the words climate change. I will talk to clients about the trend towards gradual increases in extreme climate events over time and gradual changes in our design temperatures and things like that. And there are a lot of other kind of similar euphemisms to talk about climate change and not actually use those words. They totally get it. They absolutely intuitively understand what I'm talking about, and they don't have that knee-jerk political reaction. So oftentimes framing some of these issues in the context of resilience or health will help to get people on board instead of saying green or sustainability. High performance is also another good euphemism. So with that, can you click, please? So I'm guessing that many of you are either AIA members or occasionally work with AIA members. I feel like that's a good bet in this room. So hopefully you've heard that in September, the AIA changed their code of ethics to basically, and I'm going to paraphrase here, say that all AIA members are ethically bound to talk to their clients about sustainability and energy and materials and site. And this is one bullet of many that go into detail on exactly what we're supposed to do. And so that also changes the game. So to meet architects where they are, so to speak, to help them we need to help them understand that according to their kind of governing professional organization, they would be unethical. And it's in the same code of ethics change was also about sexual harassment. So they've put not talking about sustainability on the same plane as sexual harassment. Helping architects to understand how to jump over that hurdle and how to feel more comfortable talking about these things is an important way to also help us move more broadly towards green codes, particularly in places where people don't necessarily connect with these ideas otherwise.
Great.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Eden Bruckman. I'm with the Department of the Environment, the City of San Francisco, so I'll be talking about these issues through that lens. And as far as motivations of getting green codes adopted everywhere, as all of you've probably heard several times throughout this conference, after the U.S. Talked about withdrawing from the Paris Accord, Governor Brown wanted to create a stage for non-state actors to be able to voice commitments and to increase our ability to make change with respect to climate and climate-related issues. San Francisco was the host city for that event, and the Global Climate Action Summit resulted in a number of commitments that cities and businesses made. Two that I'll mention that we're now evolving and adopting into our own regulations in the city of San Francisco are the decarbonizing buildings. It's toward net zero carbon, and that is for all new construction to be operational zero carbon by 2030, and for all existing buildings by 2050. And that is quite a huge commitment for us to tackle. And we're starting to think in terms of where Title 24 is today, what's going to come in the next round, how much we can get through interpretations in this round to be able to get inch closer to that goal for new construction. And then a lot of education for existing buildings, thinking of incentives and other ways to tie that back in. In addition, the other one I wanted to mention is about advancing towards zero waste. San Francisco led that commitment. 19 other cities signed on. And that is also a 2030 goal for generation reduction of 15% and also 50% reduction to landfill and incineration by 2030 based on 2015 numbers. And since 25% of San Francisco's landfill is construction and demolition debris, that comes back to us. And what that looks like is not just how do we recover material at the end, but we're starting to look at design for disassembly and deconstruction opportunities that come at the beginning and through our design and our construction practices. Themes like buildings as material banks, when we think of buildings as temporarily housing materials rather than this being the end game for these products, as well as a few other initiatives that really shift the conversation to the designer rather than the demolition contractor at the end of the day.
Awesome. Chris?
I thought we were going in order.
I'm different.
So good morning. I'm Chris Schwedick. I'm from Chicago, and I'm with Burnham Nationwide. and the Code Group, an architectural firm that we specialize in building code compliance and helping people getting through the permitting system. So, and I've been doing that for over 20 years. I also teach a course in building codes at Harbor College here in Palatine. So, and I've been involved in USGBC here for several years, and go back to the time in which the IGCC was originally conceived, which, in fact, the meetings took place here at O'Hare in Chicago in 2009. So the whole history of this is really fairly recent when you look at the history of codes altogether. It happened very quickly, and I think that it was different because essentially we had something that was hybrid, okay? Essentially a code married to a standard and based on a rating system. And those are three different things, okay? So the lead rating system is not a code. The 90.1 and 189.1 are not codes, and IGCC is not a standard. So to understand those three and how they would work together is somewhat challenging, I think, for municipalities. I don't know if you still have that map that you were showing yesterday about where IGC is, in fact, adopted, but so it's sporadic, you know, in various parts of the country. But the whole idea of it was to create a platform for the local jurisdiction to be able to apply LEED and other sustainable types of requirements for buildings as part of a code. And what is a code? Well, a code is a law, okay? It forces you really to do that or to adjust in some way to it. There was a very interesting presentation, maybe some of you saw it, on this municipal building that we're doing in Santa Monica, and the efforts that were being made. And so this is California, right? I mean, they created the Green Code out of Cal Green, right? That was the whole basis behind what IGCC was based on. And yet the hurdles for creating this what they were calling, I mean, the greenest building on Earth, but the effort to do that was just like anything else where you have municipal government. You're going through the various bureaucratic processes that are involved in that, and IGCC is a complicated book because essentially it's you don't just hand it to one department. It's covering all different kinds of bureaus, okay? And if you think about what a bureaucracy is, it's derived from the word bureau, okay? A chest of drawers. And each of those drawers, they don't necessarily talk to each other or even know what's inside the other one, okay? And to be able to maneuver between those and get something done, their process went through 12 months. And it was for their building, you know, it was for a government building with a permit center on the first floor.
I'm going to stop you there. That's good stuff. I think you also raise a point about adoptions. Adoptions aren't always the same, right? You have a state adoption, a local adoption, voluntary, mandatory, all that goes in the mix too. Josh.
So I'm Josh Jacobs with UL, Underwriters Laboratory. I'm their Director of Environmental Codes and Standards, which is a fancy title that means I fly around the world and work with authorities having jurisdictions on their codes and their standards. Shockingly enough, we got a title right for once. So like Chris was saying, let's start with defining what a code is, right? A code, by law, is the worst building you can build, right? We all agree with that? But we're at a conference that's talking about high-performance green buildings, which hopefully is the opposite end of that spectrum. So when we talk about green codes, do we mean the best worst buildings or the worst best buildings that we're trying to build? Because those are different if you truly honestly think about it. I know it's funny and I like to make jokes, but those are really different, your best worst and your worst best. So my answer to the question of how do we get these things adopted is let's stop thinking about these two things as separate. Like Chris was saying, 2009, when we started the IGCC and 189.1, there's people in the room who were at that original meeting at 189.1. I was not one of them. I joined a couple months later. The goal wasn't to have a green code for the next 100 years and all these other codes out here in the world. It was, hey, let's create this really cool book, better graphics than this, hopefully, in the future, and migrate those concepts that become 100% or become every day and move them into the code. So you don't have green codes and building codes. You have codes. Therefore, your worst by law is better. Low-emitting materials is accredited in LEED, and before we kind of screwed up V4 language, was getting like 80, 90, 100% participation for low-emitting materials. Why is that pigeonholed in green? It's health and safety. I got a slide coming up that's going to prove to you that the building code demands that goes in there. Why do we have two separate? Why are we referring to a green code and a code? We need to start migrating these concepts into main code. Then we don't have to worry about people thinking that when you bring up the UN Sustainable Development Goals, that you're part of some international cabal that's going to take over our government, right? Let's marry these two together. Let's bring concepts from green and just put them in the IBC. So that's my answer.
Thank you. So we've heard some good responses, I think, how you talk about it, what you can do locally to set thresholds and exceed. Chris, how the adoption can be complicated, but there's lots of ways to do it. And Josh, the imperative, right? Interested in anyone's in the audience answer to this question. Don't be shy. We have time, we have space. Although you have to get up to a mic, which is a little bit of a challenge.
All right.
Yeah.
Woo!
Thank you.
I'm David Whitmire. I'm an local architect here in Illinois. And first off, I want to chastise you, Josh, a little bit about using the word worst with codes, because it's not the worst building they could build, because even in a metropolitan area like Chicago, which is supposed to be very sophisticated, it's very hard to get buildings built to code. Even though they make it approved, there are a lot. Wow. I feel like
Now you're really going to chastise.
You want to start it over but not chastise? Just kidding.
I feel like Freddie Mercury before we were coming out.
That's
here.
right.
It's a little
Yes. Yeah.
But the biggest challenge with codes is getting people to adopt or to actually meet the code.
Yeah.
And and people would, because when you say worse, it's like there are so many bad buildings out
Lot
there.
worse.
If they would just build to the code, and I see codes as being a great resource to go to, say, hey, if you do this, this will be a good building. And, going from good to better to best is all that. And I know that I was at a conference some time ago where they're saying, oh, how do we get stuff adopted? It's like, from an architect, from a designer. And I remember I was in a room with about 40 people, and I was the only architect. Everybody was talking about codes, but I was the only guy who actually had to follow a code and design and be bound by it. Everybody else was like, do this, do that, do the other thing. And I said, if there's a way to get people to adopt codes, have less codes. And part of that gets to being able to combine codes. But when you go through a project, as a designer, you get through code fatigue, where there's just so many. And here in Illinois, we're bound by the ADA because it's a national code, but Illinois also has its own accessibility code, and they've just redone it. And instead of saying, well, let's kind of tag on to a code that you're already doing, just have another code because it's ours. And everyone's just like, let's do this code, let's do that code. Less codes is kind of the first step to be able to say, okay, I can kind of focus it. And part of it is, you've got life safety codes versus green codes, which are performance codes. But I think that's one of the first steps.
That's great.
So thank you. Absolutely fair criticism. because there are codes. Building to code is difficult, right? I mean, it has to be because it's protecting all of us, right? We demand that, right? When things don't work, we hopefully demand better. We don't always get it, but completely fair criticism. But I like at the end that we came to an agreement that there needs to be less and put it all together, right? So I'm still going to use my joke, but thank you. Right, cut you up. Who else? Jazzercise, anyway.
Liz.
Morning. Liz Beardsley, USGBC.
Morning.
I guess I would frame it as just a bottom-up approach, right, and the top-down. And we have seen some encouragement, I think, from the top-down, so from national-scale incentives. So even this year in the climate we're in, there was a bill passed, the Disaster Relief and Recovery Act, that ties some of the pre-disaster mitigation funds that FEMA administers to building code support and adopting codes. So, I mean, I'd almost say, how can we get building codes adopted everywhere? Because we still have a baseline problem in a lot of states and countries. So if we can just skip from no code to green code, that would be great. So I think we're trying to deal with getting more incentives in place. And, you know, some of the big changes in other ways where it's state authority, but the national government has been able to be successful, like the drinking age or the speed limit, is all through, you know, a lot of carrots and sticks. So we're trying to look for ways to get some pieces in there where we can.
Great, thank you.
Any responses? Yeah, one more.
Yeah, please.
Sure.
Good morning. John Fannin with City of Fort Collins in Colorado. And we've gone through several cycles of adopting sort of local amendments to the code, which then slowly get absorbed by the code. So kind of to your point, Josh. But that creates a sort of a disconnect between what we're doing and what everybody else is doing around us. Now, Colorado's kind of Wild West. Everyone has their own codes from town to town and things like that. Just to note, there's a movement afoot to, on the residential codes in particular, for local governments to maximize their voting capacity within the IECC, in that sort of has been traditionally dominated by the National Association of Home Builders and other types that I probably shouldn't have just mentioned their name, but anyway, traditional voting blocks within ICC. And there's actually a pretty good opportunity if local governments look to maximize the number of votes that they are able to exercise within that process to make some more significant steps in upcoming codes.
That's a great
definitely.
point.
Thank you.
Yeah. We're aware of some initiatives to try to get out the vote for that as well, so that's a great point. I think we're going to move to the next one, which is what gaps exist between traditional building codes and green codes, and how do we help close those?
All right, you get to listen to me again. I think it's just because they want me to shut up quicker. So this was the definition I was talking about. Traditional codes have focused on these acute issues. This building is going to fall down. This building is going to catch fire. That electrical outlet is going to shock someone, right? This is the section 101.3 of the current IBC, 2018. It's the intent section. Didn't really show up well. Mara asked Wes to actually underline what we bolded here, but Wes accurately said, well, that would have made it a code change. Those that are in code, there's like 5 of you that laughed. That's awesome. Sorry. But you can read all this. I'm not going to read it all for you, but I'm going to read out the bold areas. Minimum requirements, reasonable level of safety, public health, and general welfare. Safety to life, other hazards. So it names hazards, right? Light, ventilation, energy, conservation, fire, explosion, other hazards. I just brought up some. Isn't climate change a hazard to all of us? Isn't it about our life and safety? Unfortunately, what's happening in their home area right now, there's 300 people missing because of a massive forest fire, which came because of a drought, which happened because of climate change. That's a reasonable level of safety, is I won't have a massive fire come crashing down upon my head. It's definitely the general welfare. That's the entire northern and southern part of California is going to have to be rebuilt. Public health, safety to life. We already named fire, but drought led to said fire. I'll say that's another hazard. The IBC is not just giving us permission to bring sustainable concepts to it, it is demanding we put our sustainable concepts in the building code. It's in the intent.
Thank you.
No, it's
Is this Chris?
Oh, it's mine.
Sorry.
Okay. You can tell we rehearsed this. So, yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that the efforts to really make this blending is going to be something of a challenge. So I failed to mention that I'm also the national chair of the Codes and Standards Committee for AIA, and having seen what happened with the Code of Ethics and some other things that have been in the air lately, there's been a group formed as a subcommittee, I guess, to our group to talk about what the future of codes really should be about. Really, should it be about maintaining this status quo of every 3 years a new book comes out, and then you try to encourage adoption through local jurisdictions, or really should it be about something more in tune with the understanding that if there's a challenge here, I think it's a challenge to the standard of care. And the standard of care really needs to be addressed and perhaps even redefined as well as something more than just being able to understand the code and advocate for it. So essentially putting in design professionals' hands the understanding that they're the ones who are responsible ultimately for the compliance of a building and its performance, that they're the ones who really should be moving that wheel to be able to move these codes forward and to really deal with more of a performance-based approach for all these codes. So one of the other things that is happening too, and this may still be a decade away, but and it was a joke 20 years ago to talk about, why don't we have, like we have spell check, we have a code check, an actual program that would take the place of plan examiners, because they're kind of a dying breed right now. And so the ability to take some of these life safety functions, because they are prescriptive, and you can, in fact, in a BIM model, be able to review those in such a way that they can take the place of a plan review, and then concentrate on those aspects of a building that are really unique and don't really fit the prescriptive requirements of the code, and to try and promote the understanding that this is a dialogue now between the design professional and the code official, and they get to work together in solving a problem. I think that that's really a way of marrying these.
Follow up on your earlier point about health, and we really do need to have a deeper representation of health in our codes. And one way that San Francisco is trying to address that, at least we start typically with adopting things for our municipal projects. We try to lead by example, fix the quirks, and then deploy it more broadly to the rest of the city in our green building code. And one example of that was earlier this year we put out a carpet regulation, to end all carpet regulations. I think we worked on it for several years and interviewed and worked with 8 leading manufacturers in the industry for several years who provided, I don't even know how many pages, thousands of tidbits of information. And this regulation is a way not just for building projects, but it's also in our administrative code. So it's in our environmental code, Chapter 7, which is our municipal green building code. It's also in our admin code because carpet's a commodity. When we don't just buy it once. So we have to, in a way, it was a good reminder that these are things that we have to deal with over time. It's not just, set it and forget it kind of thing. And as a result, in that carpet regulation, there's some requirements around cradle-to-cradle certification as a minimum of silver in version 3.1 or newer, health product declarations, environmental product declarations. There's a list of chemicals that we say we will not accept, like flame retardants, antimicrobials, fluorinated compounds, which have a half-life of geologic time, and they're incredibly hazardous to human and environmental health. No PVC, no styrene butadiene. I mean, the list goes on, and we could only put that out if we had manufacturers, more than one, that had compliant products. We initially had 3 manufacturers that met that, and within months we had another, and now we have another. And so we're starting to see some changes that not just impact San Francisco's opportunity for better products, but everyone's. And if you're interested in downloading that regulation, we have a bit.ly for it, which is just sfcarpetreg, bit.ly/sfcarpetreg.
So you guys have all seen this, huh? I'm pretty sure that this is the code definition of health, safety, and welfare as you all typically think of it, right? This stair is designed in order to evacuate people in the case of a fire or another type of emergency. And that is really the attitude around our health, safety, and welfare that the code was intended. I mean, building codes really originated during the Industrial Revolution when there were some very large building fires. So that was the origin of our first set of building codes. But today, the vast majority of people are more directly impacted in their lives by their lack of opportunities for physical movement over the course of the day. And the things that are ultimately making us sick and killing us stem in part from that type of activity. Now let me ask, does this stair invite you to be physically active over the course of the day? And it may even be locked most of the time. It may even be egress only. And so imagine this. What if our codes asked us to do things that looked a little bit more like this? Now this is the extreme end. You can also probably imagine something partway in between these two images that would allow you to create a more inviting and perhaps attractive version of what's on the left that still also meets fire codes and regulations, or you have a combination of 2 different types of sets of stairs in a building. But what if building codes started to ask us to look at chronic conditions in our long-term health, safety, and welfare, and not just those immediate and acute potential issues? And both are very applicable, so it's not like we want to get rid of the function of what's happening on the left there. But there's a huge gap right now between the way we're thinking about the word health in that health, safety, and welfare. There's a big gap in what we're currently thinking about that as and where we could be going. So you guys work on that, please.
Thank you. So those are some great answers to what are the gaps that exist between traditional and green codes. And I'm going to point to that list that we created, the curative list of highly achieved LEED measures that are also lined up for the IGCC and other codes. Those are ones that are, I think, gaps, things like minimum ventilation, exceeding that a bit, low emitting materials, a lot of these things that affect the health and well-being of people, better filtration inside buildings. Those are all gaps that can be filled in by codes. That would be my answer, I guess, too. But love to hear from the audience, any reactions. What are we missing? Is there a key part?
Is this high enough? Do I have to stand like this?
Yes, you do.
I don't know. Good morning, Wolfgang Werner with Urban Fabric. I'm from New York, and I'm involved in the energy code scene, if there's such a thing, of New York City, moving to the next energy code, which is based on the IECC, obviously. And so there, when I'm teaching my courses, we have a slide similar to the mission statement of the IBC for the energy code, and it's actually already expanding sort of the mission statement beyond public safety, health, and welfare to the conservation of energy. So it's throwing in a societal goal, not a goal of an individual building. And so that's already an expansion, right? Everybody can agree on public safety, health, and welfare. That's not controversial. But when it comes to societal goals, people may disagree. And we're living in a society with a strong, climate change denialism force still. And so then it becomes tricky. But I wanted to ask or talk about and then ask a question. Honestly, it's not quite clear to me how the implementation, how the adoption of the IGCC would work in a jurisdiction that already has a whole bunch of codes in place. So if you think of the normal package that comes out of ICC, so we have the IBC as a base code, then we have the mechanical code and the fire code and the electrical, plus we have a thing called the International Energy Conservation Code, which is already aggressive in certain jurisdictions. And now you throw something in that is governing aspects in all of these different drawers of the bureau, as you mentioned it, but you can't quite replace all the existing codes with a new IGCC. So I think it's going to be difficult for the practitioners and for the code officials to wrap their minds around how that should work in practicality.
We start. That's great. Thank you, Wolfgang. First, I think you identify one of the gaps in our thing is that the energy code is that making that connection between health and wellness in the code and expanding that to the kind of greater environmental health as well. When it comes to adoptions, that's certainly a complicated task. I wonder if you guys want to address any ideas on how to streamline that and enforcement and planning for how to do the enforcement and compliance can be complicated.
Chris?
So the way IGCC was originally conceived, it was essentially an overlay. So it was something that could be addressed on many different levels in terms of zoning, in terms of water management, and all these other things that are affected. And you could pick and choose, basically. I mean, if you needed to drop out some and add others and be flexible about it. But it would take really a tremendous amount of knowledge to be able to do that. And so how you marry those two is I think, one of the problems that is that municipalities face, when they're dealing with this. And I think that there's a lot of ways in which we haven't educated enough these jurisdictions in how to approach that, and that's something that has to be done.
No. So first off, you get a bottle of white out, and you take the regular code and you go like this, and you just dump green paint all over it. Completely valid question, and there's no way to say it's easy, but it's been done. Washington, D.C., San Francisco, the entire state of California has done it. Individual municipalities around the country. And the one that's going to blow your mind, Dallas, Texas. Dallas, Texas has a green code, has adopted the IGCC for certain buildings. If Dallas, Texas can do it, any dot, no matter what the color on the spectrum, can do it. They worked with everyone. They got all the drawers, all the bureaus together, and they said, okay, problem with energy. Well, you know what? We think we're doing okay with energy, so we're not going to take that part of the IGCC. Okay, good. Washington, D.C. We have some pretty stringent VOC content regulations for paints and adhesives. We're not going to take the content, but emissions is about indoor air quality. We're going to take that from the IGCC and put it in our building code. It's not easy, but it's doable. And lots of people have done it. And if you need help, ask, borrow, steal. However you want to go about it.
I think Mara wants to chime in. Yeah.
Yeah, so after now many years of implementation of CalGreen in California, we've seen a pretty broad range of factors related to that question. In the very beginning, it was really hit or miss. Some jurisdictions basically didn't even care if you filled out your CalGreen checklist or if you filled it out and didn't actually implement any of the measures. So there were a lot of questions around that early on, particularly in some of the smaller jurisdictions that were not the Los Angeles' and San Francisco's of the state. But over time, it definitely really became integrated into everything that we do, which has been absolutely amazing to watch. And yeah, it wasn't perfect in the beginning, and it's still not perfect now, for sure. But it's way better than anything we would have done otherwise. So I would say, don't let those types of things get in people's way and just kind of move it forward, and eventually it'll settle out.
And I'll just close on that one. Again, I think it's a great point that the complexity of folding this into all your other local regulations can be a burden, and we've seen that when you adopt the book in whole, you have to kind of do this feathering where you put it all together. That's why we've curated that list of top measures that we think are ready to go in most places. That's a way to simplify it. We've also looked at, and I think it's a resource that'll be out somewhat soon, looking at who's adopted the IGCC and which parts. It's interesting, the site chapter, things that talk about site sustainability, is often not adopted because that's done within a different part of the building code or the zoning code or something. So there are places, there's kind of hot spots, if you will, and that's where we're trying to focus efforts. So I'm going to go to the next question. Do green building codes stifle leadership? So the idea here is that I think in a lot of people's minds, a green code and something like LEED are a zero-sum game. It's either or. But as you saw from kind of the intro, I hope, we're trying to make that a spectrum where everybody kind of has this coordinated ratcheting and raising over time. So I just want to ask the panelists, how do building codes stifle leadership, or do they not? I guess that's the question. And Chris, you're first. Yeah.
So this idea of a zero code was developed through the Architecture 2030 group and Ed Mezeria, and so they put it out there earlier this year as a solution, basically, to dealing with a way in which you can provide for a way to bring this into the municipal code. But when you read through it, it's really not something that's adoptable easily. And so one of the things that we're going to try and do is prepare a proposal for the IECC to incorporate the zero code for 2021. And so that's one of the ways, obviously, that these things happen. But I think that the efforts to find your way into a building code are not the easiest sometimes, especially if you're not familiar with how that is done for the ICC. And so there is, I think, need for guidance in that approach. Because you're essentially going to be creating a way in which this is going to happen and be persuadable, okay? And there's, I think, two keys to any code change. It's being persuasive and being persistent and patient, okay? Those three Ps.
Yes.
On the note of being persuasive and persistent, in San Francisco, I think one of the things that we do at the Department of the Environment is we work as conveners, and we work to bring the departments together, reinforce their priorities and hopefully the priorities of our residents. And one way that we do that is through, that we communicate that, is through our climate action plan. And so this is a really easy way for us to help reinforce some of our city's goals. So 0 stands for zero waste. 80 is the sustainable trip. So it was 50% sustainable trips by 2030, and we actually surpassed that earlier this year. And on Earth Day, our mayor said we're going to change that number to 80%. So we have a new goal. 100% renewable energy, that's also by 2030. And then Roots is quite literally about drawing down carbon, about reinvigorating soil, about expanding our urban forests, increasing pollination species in San Francisco. I also like to think of it as a metaphor for the underpinnings of society. So we've recently adopted a racial equity initiative, and it has included in that initiative is a commitment to inclusiveness and accessibility, and to focus on supporting on communities in need. And that is required for us to consider across any initiative that we try to implement. And so it's not just about climate, but it's about who we are supporting and how we are making that change.
So you're not stifled building code in the state. Absolutely. Josh.
So, does it stifle leadership? To me, this is a pretty easy question. Cal Green's been adopted / enforced since 2008 in the state of California. 2008, it was written. 2009, it went into effect, I believe, the first voluntary version-ish. What state has the most LEED buildings? Anyone want to guess? New Mexico?
It's a good guess.
California. Doesn't stifle leadership. Now, because I'm a pain in Wes's backside, I'm going to change the question. The biggest problem when Cal Green was started was not, or any green code, was not, is it going to stifle leadership? Is it going to stifle business? This is a picture of LA. Again, had Cal Green since 2008. Fairly stringent green code, first statewide green code in our nation. Some fairly stringent concepts. This isn't a picture from 2008. This is last year. There were 40 high-rise building cranes in downtown LA last year, which was the third most in the nation. Seattle and Chicago were 1 and 2. So don't tell me it's going to stop business either. You can put a green code in place and business will thrive. Redo your downtown. Bring in some cool bars. Not that I go there. But that's the way, it doesn't stifle leadership. It doesn't stifle business.
And in fact, there's a very direct relationship between code and leadership, because as Cal Green starts to get better, it pushes LEED further, and vice versa. And it's also been an incredibly powerful message to tell our clients that if they're, since they're clearly following Cal Green, well, we automatically are getting all of the prerequisites in LEED and a bunch of points, most likely too. And actually those 6 points in the Cal Green alternative compliance path that you're given are actually kind of on the low end. Really, that's like the bare minimum for projects for compliance. But most Cal Green projects actually would get way more than that just by following code. In the energy and water section, USGBC was pretty conservative with the points that they would automatically give projects, which is appropriate. But when we give that message, we say, well, actually, you're really close to LEED certification. Don't you want to do just maybe a tiny bit more and show the world that you're a leader, using LEED, and get that plaque and be able to communicate that out? It's a great message to be able to, use the code as tell people that they're most of the way there, and then that pushes more folks potentially into certification. In some cases, they're just as happy to, do Cal Green and feel like they're doing the right thing with sustainability, and that definitely is true when Cal Green was passed, some of the LEED ordinances that municipalities had previously went away, so that they were now following Cal Green instead of pursuing LEED. But at this point, LEED, because of all of those ordinances, LEED has penetrated the market so thoroughly that people are accustomed to it. And building owners sometimes are in a position of not wanting to have to answer the question of why they didn't certify. And that's a really great place to be. And so it's this chicken-egg situation back and forth within the state that has really gotten us into this leadership position where we are today. And so to answer the question about whether or not green codes stifle leadership, maybe for kind of the low end of the supposed leaders that were actually not so excited about it in the first place, but for the most part, it's all the all ships rising, or the all, what, I got that wrong. Yeah, whatever, you know what I mean. Water boats rising, everyone's, it's all moving in the right direction. And so, it's keeping everyone moving together. And with that, and I'm really excited to hear about the potential, hopefully near future approach that allows for like free lead points and prerequisites, so to speak, through IGCC as well, because as a frequent user of that path in California, it has made certification so much simpler that it encourages both at the same time. And it's definitely been a really positive thing in that market.
Great. Okay, we only have a few minutes, but any urgent, critical thoughts from the room? Yeah.
Good morning.
Morning, Hannah.
I'm Hannah Roth. I live in St. Louis, Missouri. We tend to bring up the bottom listings on when you list best places, most green buildings. You'll find Missouri at the bottom of the list. So all of you, the stories of California, to me, you all live in a pretend world that I can only dream about.
I live in Atlanta. Hold on, time out.
Well,
I'm not one of these West Coast weirdos.
Trust me, even Atlanta. So before I add a thought, is the IGCC seen as an overlay code?
Yes.
Okay, so in terms of adoption, as someone who's getting into kind of codes in St. Louis and St. Louis County, an overlay code, at least in St. Louis, is much, much easier to have adopted.
It is.
Now whether anybody opts to use it is a different story.
Yep, it's part of the iCode suite. It's an overlay.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for that clarification, because now I can use it at home. So the city of St. Louis just adopted the full IECC 2018 family of codes, including the 2018 Energy Conservation Code.
That's awesome.
And it's one of the first cities. Now, the city of St. Louis only has 300,000 people. The city of St. Louis is very small. And I'm now going to be involved in helping the county of St. Louis, which has 92 different municipalities, so it's a bigger challenge. The pushback that is happening in St. Louis are from home builders. People building homes, not huge tracts of home, in St. Louis. The increase in cost in the energy code is going to keep them from being able to sell their houses. And a lot of buildings built in St. Louis are by developers, and they're two-story, multi-use buildings. They're not these gorgeous towers. And again, it's the price differential that everybody's talking about. Everybody loves the values, but that's where everybody's hitting the wall. And I don't know if there are any thoughts. And
Yeah. Thank you for that.
So, I actually lived in St. Louis, excuse me, for many years. I worked for the HOK office there, and I currently work in Missouri, Kansas, Indiana, and a little bit in Illinois. So I know exactly what you're talking about. I sometimes like to think of California as a pretend land. Also, it's a little different, but it's actually not that different in many ways. The inherent human behavior is still similar, but the market pressures are a little bit different. My observation with working in St. Louis and St. Louis County and other parts, other areas in that part of the country, is that the conversation has to shift a little bit about when they look at the cost delta. And people are going to have a very standard, understandable, knee-jerk reaction to the cost delta and what that energy code is going to give to them. But they also need to understand how to reframe what that means and be able to use that to their advantage and to be able to communicate to home buyers what they're going to save every month in their utility bills. Because people who are trying to make ends meet and buy their first home, or maybe at the higher end of the spectrum and are still balancing their own books, are going to want to know that this home is going to save them $20 a month, $100 a month, $500 a month, depending on the home size, off of their energy bill every year, and it's going to help them over time, and they're going to be able to put some of that into their into the mortgage and the other costs. That it's a different balance. And so I've worked with a few different organizations to try to re-message some of those things. And then there's also other ways of doing that without cost, and there's renegotiations. But you have to try to help them to reframe the picture. It's not easy.
Yeah, and
good luck.
We're out of time. It's 9:00.
Yeah.
The IGCC, just a clarification, it's for high-rise residential and commercial non-residential buildings. There's a connection, very loose, to the ICC 700, which is a residential green code. But we haven't done the same efforts to line up yet with that code, and I think that's something USGBC will work on in the future, is the connection to green codes and residential. But we're starting with commercial because that's our flagship buildings that we work on. Check out our website. Thank you all for coming, and have a great rest of Greenville.
Thank you.